cigars all around. Cheers, y'all.
Well. Welcome, my friends, to a special edition of the show we call Smokin' and Toastin'. We're all about craft beer, fine spirits, and hand-rolled cigars. But today's show, a special edition pop-up, is going to be all about spirits because we are here on a Sunday afternoon because the schedule had the good fortune to put in our studio this afternoon our old friend Dan Crowell and Bill Lumsden, who's the director of distillation, Whisky Creation, and Whisky Stocks have you heard of this company, Glenmorangie? Are you familiar?
I'm pretty sure I've heard of them.
They're the bomb. Yes, they are. Yeah. So we're really excited. And, Bill, you will be pleased to know that we spare no expense on sound effects here on the show. This is a place where we're going to give it all we got. So
this is very high-tech.
I did wonder what that was.
So, Bill, I want to get back to your title in a few minutes. But first of all, welcome to the show. Now, Ian was pointing out before we got started here a moment ago that we've actually seen you on one of those, hookups on the web or by satellite or whatever. I think it was like a Google Hangout thing when you guys were introducing Spios, which we, by the way,
was delicious.
I was going to say we both became instant fans of, but it is really a pleasure to have you here in the studio to talk about. You've got since Whisky Creation is in your title. That appears to be what you've been spending your time doing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I guess my job has two parts to it. It's the ongoing maintenance of the quality of the core range, like the original and the Quinta-Ruban and the 18, etc. But also it's to do a little bit of experimentation, try and develop new products. So things like Spios and Alta, it's great to finally see them in bottle because, these are ideas that hatched up about 10, 15 years or so ago. So it's nice to see them finally see the light of day.
I just want you to know that every time I go to my bar and pull out the bottle of Spios, I try to say it the way that you say it, and it always falls
doesn't translate
far
to
short.
American accent,
It always falls far short. I just love the way that you say that.
I just have to tell you still have Spios at your house?
Well, notice I actually didn't say anything about pouring any of it. I just talked about bringing the bottle out of the bar. Yes, I do sometimes and look at it wistfully. Is what I do. No, but so just question before we go any further. The Quinta-Ruban and La Santa.
La Santa is an absolute mainstay.
You were involved. You were involved in the creation of those as well, correct?
Yeah, I think basically any Glenmorangie or Ardbegs over the last 20 years have had my fingerprints on them.
Nice.
Is the way to look at it.
Yeah. And how do you go about getting this sort of a job? Not that I figure I can apply, but how did it happen for you?
I think that there's always a little bit of serendipity involved in things like that, like kind of being in the right place at the right time.
Sure.
But, essentially you have to have a good nose and palate. And, having a love of whiskey certainly helps do it. And I've got a scientific background which helps me develop some of the more technical projects.
Right.
But first and foremost, you need to be a whiskey lover. That's the most important thing, I would say.
Because you really would have to have an absolute passion for it to be able to approach it the way that I think you have to approach it, right?
I would say so. And, ever since I was a little boy, I'm a little bit like a dog that I've always gone round sniffing things. So I've got a highly developed sense of smell and taste.
Yeah. So Glenmorangie was founded,
1843.
43, okay. Yeah. So obviously, by the time that you came along, this brand was well established, loved around the world. That's a pretty big responsibility to step into.
How many expressions did Glenmorangie have when you?
When I first joined the company, they essentially had 3. They had the 10-year-old, which we call the original now, the 18-year-old, and there was this funky new expression called the Portwood finish. Wow. And the history is quite interesting to me because it originally was released not anything to do with a crazy new flavour, but it was actually to try and get more shelf facings for the brand. And when I joined, there was a little bit of this fledgling experimentation going on, so I had carte blanche to develop the range as we know it today.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So you kind of saw it coming that there was going to be sort of an expansion of the whole world of whiskey, if you will.
You know, I mean, without a word of a lie, Cruz, I was working for DCL, Diageo at the time, and I was reading my GQ magazine, and I saw an article. I put my porn mag down and started reading the GQ. And I was reading an article about this crazy new Glenmorangie whiskey. And it inspired me so much, that and the fact that Glenmorangie was the first whiskey I ever tasted, it made me decide to apply for the job of Glenmorangie distillery manager. And that's how it all came about. So it was this idea. I thought that this would be a fun company to join and maybe be allowed to experiment and try different things. And that's exactly how it's turned out.
Exactly what it, so how many, if you don't mind me asking, how many things have you tried that didn't become a released expression?
Okay, my strike rate is pretty high there, and probably only about 5% don't quite see the light of day. And you know, back in the day, the company did blended Scotch whisky as well. We don't do that anymore. So I had a ready avenue for blending things away if they didn't quite work.
Right.
But you know, you kind of have a gut feel whether or not something's going to work. And, you know, if you're making a product like Alta, for example, where you're buying hundreds of barrels at a time, you know, it's a lot of money to tie up in something that's not going to work. But I would say less than 5% to answer your question.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
That's outstanding.
If we had less than 5% of our shows that kind of sucked, you know, I would feel like we were wildly successful, you know.
Is that a technical term? Kind of sucked.
Kind of sucked. Yes, that is. You'll find that's you know, there's a specific range when you look at it that falls into the kind of sucked area. No, the thing I was going to say, you could probably have a huge failure rate as long as the successes were large. But in your case, you're pointing out that by the time you get to the point of ordering the bottles, you sort of know what you have on your hands, is right?
I mean, the way I look at it is that every drop of the spirit is very precious, and I'm simply the current custodian of the quality, so I don't want to do things that are not going to taste good.
Now, you're obviously involved with Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, and I know we're here to talk about the Alta, but do you have a favorite between the peatier, you know, the more like intense sort of Ardbeg vibe, and then the more sort of pure single malt vibe of Glenmorangie?
I have to say, my style of whiskey primarily is more leaning towards the sort of delicate, elegant style that Glenmorangie is. But I always find with whiskey, it's kind of a mood thing, and it's maybe a little bit like craft beer, that you don't always want to have a double imperial stout, but sometimes if you're in the mood for it, it hits home.
Right.
Sometimes it's great. Other times you really just kind of want an amber ale, or maybe a you know, something that's got a little bit different flavor profile.
And it's fun having Ardbeg in the portfolio because it's so completely different from Glenmorangie. They're like opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right. And it's I would imagine sort of a completely different source of pride to be able to do that style and do it as well as Ardbeg has done. Has got to be, I don't know. It's kind of like if you had a rugby team and a soccer team, and they were both really good, right? So I was trying to reach across the pond there with that sports reference. Did that work? So you were here in the U.S., obviously here to talk about this new expression, and I just want to make sure I'm showing this to the camera appropriately here. This is the Alta. First of all, what does the word mean?
Yeah, Alta, Scottish Gaelic word for wild.
Wild.
So we always go,
We're required to do that, actually.
That actually is going to work so much better for him, Dan, than it is for
I
you.
know, yeah.
You know, there's something about the accent.
Hideously
It's
embarrassing. but I
going
do
to
it.
work much better for him. So Alta means wild, which obviously that has some kind of relation to the style of the spirit. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So it's an experiment using a wild yeast strain.
Okay.
So a strain of yeast we found in the natural environment close to the Glenmorangie distillery. And, you know,
This almost sounds like a plot for a sci-fi movie. I'm just, you know what I mean? Like
Every Scooby-Doo episode
That's
starts this way.
Thank you. And it would have been great whiskey too if it weren't for those darn kids. So I'm sorry. We interrupted you.
I like your way of thinking there, because all of these products have got a little bit of a plot, a little bit of a story to them. And the story of this one goes back to the late, great Michael Jackson. Not the pop star Michael Jackson, but the whiskey and
whiskey
beer
writer.
writer.
Yes, yes.
I knew Michael very well. He visited me many times in my day as Glenmorangie distillery manager.
He did not have a monkey, which I think is important to point out.
Not when I met him, he didn't. Right?
Good. That's important to point out.
But yeah, Michael, in his very first World Guide to Whiskey, had this little passage in it, and he had featured most of the well-known whiskies globally in it. And there was a little section in Glenmorangie, and he talked about that distillery having its own unique yeast strain. And I just happened to have done my PhD in yeast physiology, so I was obsessed by yeast anyway. And no matter how hard I tried, I could find no evidence of this at all in the company.
Really?
And I even worked with the company archivist, a gentleman called Ian Russell, and we could find nothing about it. So I decided there and then that we were absolutely going to have our own unique yeast strain. And that's where it all came about. So the genesis of this idea goes back more than 20 years.
And this is all about the lost wild yeast strand that you actually never found.
Absolutely, that's it.
So when you then set out to do it on your own, how does that work?
Well, there's various ways I could have gone about it. You know, I could simply have left the fermenters open, you know, in the style of a Belgian lambic fermentation. But I pretty much thought that I would have ended up with all sorts of horrors in the washback, and it wouldn't just be yeast in there.
Right.
Now, I have to say I did try it, and let's just say that 5% ratio
Chalk it up
comes
to the
into
5%,
play.
yes.
So I thought, right, okay, where else can I find yeast? And the answer is almost everywhere. You know, yeast's all over our own bodies. If we swabbed this desk, there would be yeast on it. But I'm an ex-maltster and barley buyer by training, so I knew fine that barley growing in the field, the ears of the barley are covered in microorganisms.
Right.
So I took some ears of our own cadball barley, which grows in the field right beside the distillery. I sent it down to my partner Lallemande, the yeast supplier, and they swabbed the ears of the barley, and we isolated. We found quite a few strains of yeast there, but we isolated one in particular which we felt would have fermentative capacity, and they grew that up into industrial quantity for me.
You find the yeast and then you culture it.
That's it.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And this goes back to what you studied,
Absolutely.
really, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
this gets back to the actual pure science of the whole thing.
Which was the thing that I found so exciting as a geek, as a scientist myself. And I had enough for 1 week's worth of production. And the most beautiful part of this project, and this is entirely coincidence, that by the time our partners Lallemande had grown up enough of the beastie, which we called Saccharomyces
I was just
diamath.
about to ask what the name of it is. Say
Yeah.
it one more time.
Saccharomyces diamath. So standard yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae for brewing or distilling, but diamath, Scottish Gaelic word meaning God is good. Because that's what the ancient Egyptians used to call this phenomenon of alcohol production. They didn't know what was doing it, but they knew that God was good.
So
to
they
give
thought
them the-
God was just kind of taking care of it, yeah.
So that's where it came from. But when the yeast was ready, the very same barley growing in the field had been harvested, had been dried, had been malted, and was in at the distillery. So the barley, the malting barley was fermented with the original wild yeast that was growing on it, which was the beautiful squaring of the circle, if you like.
So when you went about cultivating this strain of wild yeast, did you do that with the idea of let's try this and see what kind of flavor that it creates? Or was it more like I'm going for a particular kind of flavor and I think this yeast will lead me there?
No, it was much more the former, Cruz, because in reality, I had a fairly good idea that if it was a Saccharomyces strain, it would produce alcohol.
Right.
But apart from that, I really had no idea and was completely open-minded as to what I might end up with. And I think you have to approach experiments like that. You can't prejudge the results.
Right. And once you get to the results, is it something where you can say, and I'm not suggesting that you did this, but is it something where you could have said, okay, I like this, but I'd like it to be just a touch more this way, and go back and tweak the yeast process? Or is it something where you're going to kind of get what you're going to get?
I think there's a certain amount of tweaking would have been possible, but you're talking very long time scales
Right, of course.
for this, and I realised that in my opinion, to make good single malt Scotch, you're looking at a minimum of 7 to 8 years of maturation
Right.
before it's ready. So it's not like I can make a little tweak here and then have a product
And then test it and know what you
to,
got.
To a
Yeah.
certain extent,
So-
I had what I had.
When did you find the yeast? How long ago was that? What's the time scale from the time you found that yeast?
The time scale was about 11 years ago, Ian, when we first found it. And, I have to say it took me a couple of years of dabbling around with laboratory-style fermentations, a little bit of trial work before we were ready to take it to the full scale.
Wow.
That's awesome. So 11 years to come up with
And
Alta.
And the part, I think, of your job that fascinates me the most, beyond what it would take to understand how this culture of yeast was going to develop and how this is going to work, the part that fascinates me the most is that at a certain point, you've got to taste this and say, okay, I think that, I'll pick a number, 7 years from now, this is going to be what we want. And then you put it in the cask and it starts aging.
Well,
to me, that talent right there, that skill of being able to say, in this form, what I'm tasting is going to lead us to something we want 7 years from now, 12 years from now.
You're touching on a question that I have. So when you take a project like this and you start to age it, do you have an idea how long it's going to take, or are you actually trying it year by year and seeing what it's doing? Or are you doing a little both?
There's a little bit of both there, Ian. And I have to say, when I originally set out, most of the real detailed analysis I did was on the new make spirit. So comparing classic Glenmorangie new make to the new make made with the Saccharomyces diamath. And there was very distinctive differences in character there. And we did a lot of analysis by GC of the key volatile flavour congeners, the alcohols, the aldehydes, the ketones, the fatty acid esters, all these things that give fruitiness and floral notes to the whiskey. So the difference was quite marked. And I thought, okay, I don't want to age this for too long, because if I leave it in for 18 years, the chances are the influence of the wood would mask the differences.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, I had a feel, but nothing more than that. And I was probably originally going to let it go for the full 10 years. But it's just a little bit shy of that, about a year or so. And the reason for that is, I have to say, that I was getting bored reading in the press. But not just about that, but I was getting bored reading in the press of all the new so-called craft distillers in Scotland who were going to do something so radically different, and they were going to have wild yeast. And I thought, oh yeah, boring. Did that 10 years ago.
Except nobody knew, because they'd not been able to taste
so
it.
that, as much as anything, made me think, right, okay, we better get on with this and bottle it.
Wow.
Well, and the patience you have to have from the start of a project to the end of a project, because you can't, technically, I guess you can make whiskey in a short amount of time, but you have to age it, and you have to do all those things to make it that product.
But
so
see, to me, that's part of what
fascinating.
makes this whole thing so special. Because when you sit down, to me, whiskey is never about the way that it's consumed in the movies. It's never about walking up to the bar, they pour it for you, you slam it back, or you guzzle from the bottle. It's not about that at all. It's about finding the moment, when you're able to sit down and really appreciate and enjoy, and let time just kind of slow down. It's something that's worth waiting for. It's about patience, if you will. And so that's why I think it's so perfect that this is the way that a really great spirit like this is created, because that's how it's meant to be. You know what I mean? Not to be too, too pie in the sky about it, but it seems like that's the way it should be, because that's the kind of spirit this is.
I mean, these sort of experiments, I've always got loads of them on the go at any one time. So I've got a pool of products, and we're never 100% sure if Spios is going to be launched or Bacalta or whatever. And it's not until you get about a year out do you think, right, okay, next year's one's going to be this. So there's plenty more things bubbling away underneath the surface.
So when you tasted it and said, okay, we could do it, like, was it what you had envisioned? Was it what you had hoped for?
It was. Yes and no, Cruz, because the other thing I would say here is that I used American oak ex-bourbon barrels as I do for original. But I actually used refill barrels because I didn't want too much influence of the wood coming
Those would
through.
be the second fill.
Yeah,
Right.
so original is like 60% first fill, 40% second, and Alta is all third fill to try and maximize the difference.
Because I thought I remember that you guys in your general production will only use the barrels twice.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And so in this case, you're trying to not get too much from the
Exactly.
barrel, as opposed to
Yeah.
some cases where you may be wanting more from the barrel.
And if you imagine a triangle, and you've got the base of the triangle, that's the new make spirit. The difference is huge. And then as the years go on, it comes narrower and narrower, and you lose a little bit of the difference. So if I'd left this in for 20 years, for example, you probably wouldn't have picked up as much of the nuances of
Differences, yeah.
flavour coming directly from the yeast.
It would have been more similar to the
Yeah.
other product that had been aged for
and
that.
of course, if
amount
I'd
of
put it
time.
into a sherry cask, for example, I would just have lost everything.
You would have basically had something that came out like something that had been something else that had been aged in sherry.
Now these start from the same distillate
Yeah.
completely. So which
The only difference is the yeast.
yeah, so the yeast is the
everything
only
else
difference.
is
and
the
then
same.
and then you use
Yeah.
that third fill barrel.
Yeah.
So you didn't. Well, the Glenmorangie is the original is a very delicate flavor.
Well, it
anyway, so
Yes, it is. In fact, it is the perfect, when people express curiosity about single malt scotch, it is the perfect one to say, here's where you should start, right? Not that it's necessarily a starter whiskey, because it's one that you are going to want to keep in your bar, like, pretty much from now on.
see, and that one flies off my shelf pretty fast. But I'll almost always have a bottle of La Santa because that's one of my absolute favorite expressions from you guys. I mean, at the price point and the flavor profile, everything about it. I mean, and that's one that when people ask me, "Hey, what should I try?" I don't really know much about Scotch. I'm like, right here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's a great introductory whiskey, but a lot of people, and myself included, have gone full circle in that, I can drink anything in the range I want. I can
right.
fill my bath up with Signet and dive in if I really want.
Oh,
But
wait, hold on. I'm just savoring that moment because that would be a thing. Let me tell you. That would be... Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
So but it's not necessarily a vision you want to think about too much. But I drink more of the original because I just love its clean, elegant, easy drinking taste. And again, I drink it neat. I have it in a highball with soda. I sometimes add ginger ale. You can do all sorts of, but it's very versatile.
I want to point this out to the audience. This is the man that creates this. It's not polluting the whiskey. It's drinking it the way you want it.
That's right.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a really good
There's
good point,
so many
because you say
people that
so
just
often.
they just think,
Yeah.
oh well, if you take something like this and you put water or you put ice in it, you're just completely no, drink it how you want it. As a matter of fact, water opens it up a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
that's...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I've just added water there. That's the way I like doing it like this. We call it releasing the serpent because it opens up the bouquet a little bit.
I love it.
But, Dan and I last night to kick off with, we had an old fashioned with original at the restaurant, and it was very good.
It was lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really well made.
All right, so you have poured for us both a bit of the original and a bit of the Alta. I'm supposing the best way to get a feel for the Alta is this sort of side by side, right?
Exactly. That's these whiskies, the private edition range. I like to think people are all going to compare them to the original, so they can see exactly what the difference is, whether it's a different barrel type or different barley variety like in Tussail or different yeast here in Alta. So I'm just going to do the same. I'm going to add a couple of splashes of water to my Alta.
Okay.
I can kind of hand that around a little bit.
Thank you.
Give you.
So we'll splash this.
And you know, with the original, you get that very, very classic Glenmorangie note. It's very, very clean. It's very fresh. It's got a kind of meadow freshness about it. Lovely floral notes.
Fruitiness right
Yeah,
there.
and sort of-
Fruitiness and just that touch of minerality.
Yeah, that's right. That flinty minerality. And then when you go to the Alta, it's altogether more earthy, slightly more spicy.
There's a darker sweetness to
Oh,
it
wow,
too.
definitely so. That's so interesting.
Like almost a caramel kind of.
Yeah, kind of
And see,
toffee.
Toffee,
kinda,
yeah, toffee. That's
Had you not
better.
explained the process, I would have immediately be trying to attribute that to what it was aged
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, but no, this I think this is genuinely the difference from the yeast. And I don't know if this is auto-suggestion or what, but if I'm having a pizza, I like to make pizza myself. I make my own passata, boil the tomatoes down, make my own dough. And with the live yeast culture you add to that, I'm sure I can get a hint of that from the bouquet of Alta. And again, if you try a sip, gents, of the original,
And then go directly to a sip of the Alta.
it's just so soft, so sweet, so smooth. You know, that lovely creamy, peachy and vanilla type flavour. And then with the Alta, which is at slightly higher proof.
It's amazing. I just again to our audience, the Glenmorangie 10 has almost no heat to it whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's
it's
unbelievable
amazingly
how silky
smooth, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it
And-
really
and
is.
that's attributable to the quality of the American oak barrels
Yeah.
we use.
I mean-
and it's absolutely what I'm looking for in it, that lovely softness in the palate.
Now, you do get a little more heat with the Alta, as you were suggesting. It's a higher proof, correct?
Right. That one's bottled at 51.2 versus 43 ABV.
And again, the reason I did that was simply because this is the 10th anniversary release of the private edition series. So I wanted to give consumers a bit more oomph
bit
for their
more
money.
Yeah.
This feels like it has a little bit oilier mouthfeel
Yeah.
to it as well. It kind of spreads across the palate and has this really nice
Yeah,
warmth.
more viscosity to it.
I want to describe that flavor that you get, not right at the beginning, but that flavor in the middle. I want to describe it as almost like a caramel, but then it changes, and then I don't have. I'm like, oh no, it's not really caramel. So it really is one of those that makes you stop and say, I'm going to have another sip and figure this out. You know what I mean?
It makes me think of like a brand of popcorn we have, and you call Butterkists, toffee popcorn. That's what this
Yes.
reminds me a little bit of.
Yes, absolutely.
I kind of pick up like a little apricot in there as well. It's really, really interesting how intense and complex this is.
And it makes me think of sort of like mandarin orange syrup, that type of thing going on.
Wow.
So it's not radically different from the original. And
No,
we wouldn't expect that, but
Right.
it's different enough to make it to justify bottling it. So I say it's something I've always wanted to do to live up to the story of the great man Michael Jackson. And we actually spoke to Michael's widow and his daughter to ask their permission to mention his name, and they were highly delighted. It's
Oh, they were? That's so cool.
It's a kind of homage to Michael.
Wow. Well, I can tell you, this is really unique. I'm not sure I've ever tasted any other expression that quite has this vibe to it. It's very unique. There are so many things after you have been fortunate enough to do what we do and be able to taste a lot of different things. There are so many things that you go, well, that's very similar to this. I may like it a little bit better, or I may like the other a little bit better, but it's very similar to this or that, or you kind of find those, 8, 9 different sort of tastes that seem to sort of predominate a particular category. But this would definitely be number 11.
Now, when we started this show, Cruz hadn't experienced as many scotches.
That's true.
And
was
so I started
much
introducing
more
him, and I have
knowledgeable than other
a
spirits.
modest collection, but I started introducing him to some of my favorites. And And once I got him through pretty much all the fruitier, more delicate ones, then I brought in the Ardbeg.
Good plan.
And I will say, it took me a while.
Yeah.
It took me a while.
Here, check this out.
But I came around.
And speaking of Ardbeg there, if I tried this experiment at Ardbeg using its classic, very heavily peated malt, you wouldn't have picked up the difference at all.
This would have been too subtle for that.
You,
Yes,
you have to do some slightly more radical things at
Well,
Ardbeg
it's so
to bring
robust in the first place, right?
It truly is. But this is so. I'm guessing that once you finally get to bottle this and take it out, this has to become your new favorite expression for at least the next year or so, right?
I think it is, because it's one of the funkiest experiments I've worked on, and it's something very close to my heart. And we're not going to use the Saccharomyces diamath for all of our everyday production,
Sure.
not least because the yield of alcohol is much lower. But for 1 week every year now, since we started this, I have been producing a batch of whiskey from the Saccharomyces diamath.
Because of what's involved in developing this yeast strain and then doing this kind of production, does this become a more expensive whiskey to produce?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All these private edition things. In fact, I would go as far as to say I doubt some of them even made money for the company because they were so expensive. But that's not the point.
But the point is to continue to show what can be done and to sort of continue to make people kind of look at your name and go, yeah, those guys, right?
Right, exactly.
And it's an interesting approach. I'm not sure that American businesses always look at that the same way. And you can't certainly speak for everyone, but I think there's...
It takes a business with a long history to be able to do that.
Right.
And to be able to stick by that. I want to point out, I actually put a few more drops in this Alta, a few more drops of water, and now it's like the aroma has changed to butter and a bunch of different things that I'm picking up. It's pretty amazing how it evolves. Just adding
that's a very good description. Butter.
Butter,
one of the things I love.
like in a great way,
Yeah.
Well, the original is one of the... It's got more of a buttery characteristic to it than I think any single malt that I can think of off the top of my head, at least. It's just a very smooth, and the butteriness being sort of the first thing that hits the top.
It's interesting, too, because we talked about the viscosity of this. So I've added water twice now, and you'd think it would thin that out a little bit, but it really doesn't. However, it does spread across the palate much faster.
And of course, the Alta is non-chill filtered, so there always should be a little bit more viscosity in there as a result of that.
Wow. Bill, did you see the explosion in whiskey and distilled spirits coming that we have, witnessed over the past 5 to 10 years?
I have to be honest and say, no, I did not envisage that at all. And the fact that, American whiskey, Japanese whiskey, all these other types are becoming very popular is a great thing for the whole category.
I think it is too,
if you'd asked me 30 years ago when I started out on my career, if I envisaged this, I would have said absolutely not. So it's a very exciting time.
It really, and in the position that you're in, though, you've also got to anticipate this to some degree because you've got to keep up with demand for all of your expressions, right?
Yeah, and it's quite a sobering thought that, I'm a very youthful 58 years old, so I'm not planning on retiring anytime soon. But a lot of the things I'm starting off today, I sit back and think, I'll be gone before they see the light of day. But, it's kind of, I want to leave a legacy for, the next generation. And a gentleman in my team, Brendan, who Dan and Rennie know, he will eventually succeed me when I finally... I've told him not to be impatient because I'm not going anywhere soon. But, I want to leave down some nice nuggets for him to bring out
Seems
as well.
like a job worth waiting for.
With all of your expressions, how many bottles does Glenmorangie produce in a year?
Okay, the brand itself sells round about 650,000 9-litre cases. So that's, say, 650,000 times 12, whatever that is.
Okay, yeah.
I'm
lot.
hopeless at maths.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
But of that total, the private edition range is less than 1%. So it's a
that
very
interesting?
small part of it.
Isn't
And they
that
become
interesting?
quite collectible.
Right, right. And is there a chance that the private edition stuff becomes more limited? In other words, is Alta going to be around for a good while, or is this something grab it while you can?
Absolutely not. This is a one-off.
A one-off, okay.
And by the very nature of these experiments, they'll never be done again. And we're selling it to our consumers on the basis that this is a one-off, so it would be dishonest for me to do it again.
Right,
so
right.
I'm not just saying this to try and sell it. You grab a bottle while you can, because it will not appear again.
So when something like a La Santa or a Quinto Raban comes along, what makes you decide that that one's going to be a more permanent addition to the line?
There's no hard and fast answer to that, Cruz. It just really depends on, we trial it and see how successful it is, and then if people like it and we have the capability of producing it in larger volumes, and by that I mean if you've got access to a steady supply of quality sherry casks, then there's a chance it can become part of the core range.
And I've got a figure, by the way, that finding quality casks of all kinds has got to be something that's getting harder and harder, particularly for the Scottish distilleries, even though there's more American bourbon being made all the time, and obviously that's the most popular, I guess, of the cask. It's got to be getting harder and harder to find the ones that you want and get them there.
Yeah, it's very important to set up a good relationship with your supplier. And most of my wood suppliers, whether it's for American oak ex-bourbon barrels or sherry casks or port casks, I've had these relationships for 25 years or so. But yeah, it's something you have to take into consideration.
Wow. So any idea, I realize you're just getting this out there, but any idea what might be next?
Yeah,
the next Private Express?
I can say, this is Private Edition 10, so I can say with some certainty that the next one will be Private Edition 11.
I would never have guessed that.
You know, it's on
You
this
heard it
show.
here first, folks. Yeah.
It's on this show that you hear those real breakthrough things that you're not going to hear everywhere else. So,
Now,
is Chris Hart, I'm talking to you. He ain't talking about 11 when it comes on your show. I'm just saying.
Is this a once a year at a regular?
Yeah, the idea is at the start of each year we'll release something like this. So probably next February, March time. I'm fooling around with you here. I do know what Private Edition 11 is going to be.
I felt sure that you did, yes.
I'm going more back into wood expertise for that one.
Oh, interesting.
Rather than,
okay.
but apart from that.
But I understand, but that's interesting, and that's got to be, I would guess, the fun part of your job, right?
The whole thing I do is absolutely marvelous, and I don't even look upon it as a job.
Yeah.
It's a passion. I'm just so fortunate to be able to work in something I love like this.
Well, you are doing an amazing job. The Alta is terrific, and I'm just I'm excited to be able to spend a little more time with this, try it with just a little more water. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful things about these kind of expressions is that they can change so much from your first sip to, adding water or maybe trying it over a cube of ice, seeing what that will do to it. So very, very impressive. And I'm so glad you get to come and spend a little time with us here in the States to tell us all about
gents, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come. It's been a fun little tasting afternoon.
Well, you are absolutely always welcome on the show. And Dan, thanks so much for setting this up.
Oh, not a problem.
We gotta talk about what's next, because we have some big and exciting things coming in the future that we want you to be a part of. So,
fantastic.
Wow, I am so thrilled, Bill, that you were able to come and share this with us, and it's always wonderful to have someone with a with a very elegant Scottish accent on the show, because it just feels like it takes us up in the class area. You know what I mean? Makes the show more classy, and
Y'all
takes
aren't from around here, are you?
Exactly. Exactly. So that combined with our ultra high end sound effects, I mean, this was a really really important show. So thank you for joining us for this special edition of Smoking and Toasting. This one will be posted right in between the normal shows. It just won't be one of the numbered shows. those, and we'll be back with number 126 on Thursday. When, by the way, Peter Clifton from the Ready Room and from Ritual will join us to do Valentine's Day cocktails on
very
the
nice.
Valentine's Day
Valentine's
show.
Day.
So we're really excited about that. In the meantime, let me show you the Alta again, because you're going to want to find this quickly when it hits your shelves, because I'm getting the impression we don't expect this to be around for too long.
No,
right?
it won't. It'll sell out.
All right, so there you go. Glenmorangie, what a wonderful brand, and we just appreciate you guys being on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's Smoking and Toasting, and guys, I'm going to toast with the Alta, if you would.
Yes.
Cheers.
Thank you,
Just you.
Cheers. Delightful.